For 5 days in May, Britain was gripped by an epic political drama.
On Sunday, I was thinking, I probably will be Prime Minister. On Monday, I was thinking, by the end of Monday, I definitely won't be Prime Minister.
It's a story of three men and the tangled relations between them.
I don't think Nick found him absolutely impossible. I think he found him a bit Gordonish.
He's a proud man, and I think I saw immediately it would have been easier for me to have said that to him one-on-one.
Tonight we reveal what really happened behind closed doors.
In the Monday meeting, they were far more antagonistic, a bit dismissive, a bit arrogant.
I look around the room thinking, my God, what has happened here?
Look, we're only yards there from the windows of Downing Street. Gordon Brown is in there wondering what we're doing, and we have to make sure we are getting him out.
And we listen in on the calls which made history.
Nick, I have to do this now. I can't stay on. It's a choice one way or the other. You've made the choice.
I remember having to ring Samantha and saying, well, we could be going to the palace, you'd better get your frock on.
This was 5 days of drama that really mattered.
"3 a.m. election night. David Cameron should have been certain of victory. In fact, he was certain of nothing. Despite 5 years trying to make his party electable and the longest recession since the war, the Tory leader arrived at party HQ knowing he'd not done enough to secure victory.
It was a mixture of, obviously, you're exhausted because you've had an incredibly tough campaign. You're elated because the election's over, but just massively uncertain about what on earth is the next hours and next days going to bring. And yes, the sense that you might have come to the end of one thing, but you didn't have the certainty of knowing what the next thing was going to be. And it was a very strange sense, because nobody knew what was going to happen next.
We've been here since 10 o'clock yesterday evening, and no sign of any one party having a majority.
Before any new government could be formed, deals would have to be done.
This is the election that nobody clearly won.
It's tantalising for David Cameron. Look how close he has got, but he's not quite there.
What we know is we're in for an extremely interesting night.
We're not going to lose any more Conservative LCs.
This is what you couldn't see on the night. David Cameron totting up the results. A day before, his team had agreed that if they got more than 300 seats, they could form a minority government.
So 306.
But now, he felt differently.
It was going to bed that night, or rather that morning, knowing we hadn't done enough to win outright, and starting to think through, well, what does this mean? What are the possibilities?
He wasn't the only one who spent the early hours thinking about the numbers and the possibilities. Gordon Brown flew back from Edinburgh to London and soon left his allies in no doubt. He wasn't ready to accept defeat.
Gordon Brown was a master of power par excellence. Gordon and the people around Gordon were determined, so far as we could, legitimately within the rules, to stay in power. We saw this as a straight and very important competition for power between us and the Conservatives.
Hello, Prime Minister. Is it all finished?
Good evening. It's been a very long night. There's still a long way to go.
A long way to go, which he calculated could end up with him staying in Downing Street if Labour could form a coalition with the Liberal Democrats.
When Gordon Brown has made up his mind that something is desirable, doable and necessary, he just goes for it. I mean, he's a great snowplower. He drives his way through. I think he genuinely felt that his, as it were, his sort of last great mission, or, what the last great thing he could do for Britain was to save the country from the Conservatives.
186.
The man who was the clear and unexpected loser of election night would now have to choose between Brown and Cameron.
This has obviously been a disappointing night for the Liberal Democrats. We simply haven't achieved what we had hoped. Very mixed emotions. I mean, from a desperate hankering to see my children, I haven't seen for a while, desperate need for some sleep because I hadn't slept at all, and yeah, disappointment, real disappointment. But all along, a sort of a sense of, right, I've got to grit my teeth now, however tired I am, however disappointed I am that we didn't get the number of seats we wanted. There's a really big task at hand now. People deserve to know what we think, how we're going to approach this, try and do it as kind of consistently and as openly as possible.
Throughout the campaign, Nick Clegg had insisted that the public were the kingmakers. Now he could no longer deny that, in fact, he was.
Nick Clegg, are you going to do a deal with the Tories?
Whichever party gets the most votes and the most seats, if not an absolute majority, has the first right to seek to govern, either on its own or by reaching out to other parties.
Watching him, his mentor, who, like many in his party, had spent a lifetime fighting the Tories.
It occurred to me that morning that the electorate had invented an excruciating instrument of torture for the Liberal Democrats. Our hearts went one way, but the mathematics went the other. And that's absolutely right. I mean, it wasn't excruciating. If the electorate had moved 1% differently than it had, almost all those problems would have been self-resolving.
On the morning after the inconclusive election night before, it was clear that voters hadn't determined who Britain's next government would be, so politicians were going to have to do it for them. Both main parties had a shot at taking power, but both risked forming governments so weak they'd be thrown out in the House of Commons and forced to call a second election. It's quite a dream for a political pundit, but for Britain's top civil servant who prepared for months for a hung parliament, it was a nightmare.
We had individual civil servants playing the roles of the different leaders, and indeed there was one infamous scenario 4, which was just like the result that we actually got. And the good news about it is that we therefore role-played it. The bad news is that we didn't actually succeed in coming to a good conclusion.
The reason that mattered was what was happening in Europe. On the streets of Athens, there were riots, and Europe's governments were divided over how to stop the Greek debt crisis from spreading. If Britain looked rudderless at this time, officials feared what some called a perfect storm. The markets would punish uncertainty.
What might have been a minority government wouldn't have the strength in Parliament to be able to pass the tough measures that were needed to get us through this problem. So the key issue then was that the markets would really make us pay a price on the Monday morning by selling our debt, and that would have been a real problem for the country.
The clock was now ticking. The civil service would provide advice, facilities and support for political negotiations. But the next move would have to come from one of the men who could lead a new government.
What both David Cameron and Gordon Brown understood on the Friday morning was it was perfectly possible for a non-Conservative government to be formed. The other parties would all be very likely to support, tacitly, a Lib government. So David Cameron was faced immediately with an anti-Tory majority in the House of Commons unless he produced a game-changer.
That is precisely what David Cameron had decided to do. Labour predicted that he would claim victory and attack the squatter in Downing Street. What they didn't anticipate was this.
I want to make a big, open and comprehensive offer to the Liberal Democrats. I believe that we in the Conservative Party can give ground, both in the national interest and in the interest of forging an open and trusting partnership. I didn't think that we sort of did coalitions in Britain, but it's just on the morning of the election, waking up with the numbers as they were, the situation as bleak as it was for the country, it just seemed to me this is the right thing to do.
Opinion in Downing Street was divided. Most close to Gordon Brown believed that the Lib Dems would never fall for Cameron's advances. They thought the Tories had made a mistake. Most, but not all.
My reaction to that was what he said, how he said it, the overture he was making was actually quite impressive. I mean, it showed an openness to a sort of new politics, a sort of arch pragmatism. Others around me, including Gordon, all thought that it was a terrible mistake and showed great weakness on Cameron's part and that it was a huge strategic error. I must say I couldn't see the error in what he was saying at all. I must say I felt this guy knows what he's doing and he's going to motor.
The Tory leader had completely wrong-footed, not just Labour, but those Liberal Democrats who yearned to do a deal with Labour.
My first thought was that hasn't been dreamt up since 10 p.m. last night when the polls closed. That must have been in preparation. It's polished, it's clearly very, very carefully thought out.
The Tories are wary of admitting that they prepared for anything except victory. But before the election, they did detailed planning for a hung parliament, and their leader went even further.
David Cameron had mused out loud about coalition as a possibility. Did he talk to you about it?
I think only mused. We hadn't done any work on it. We hadn't thought what the consequences would be. Yes, he certainly will have said, you know, we might have to do that, or the country might need that, but we hadn't really planned it.
If they hadn't planned for this, it certainly didn't look that way. David Cameron was soon on the phone to Nick Clegg, on screen a reminder to express appreciation for how his opponent had handled himself and to agree how negotiations would now start.
The first face-to-face talks between the Conservatives and Lib Dems are expected to take place tonight.
The two leaders agreed to send 4 negotiators each to the Cabinet Office, just yards from Downing Street. In the days to come, Whitehall, a road normally the scene of dignified ceremonial, would be turned into a rolling scrum of cameras, reporters and bemused onlookers.
The pressure on the men who David Cameron and Nick Clegg sent into this room in the Cabinet Office was immense. After all, they'd barely slept since the election. The room was said to be stiflingly hot. And just outside were waiting not just the Cabinet Secretary, but Her Majesty's principal private secretary. The 4 men on each side of the table were left in no doubt as to what was expected of them. The markets were watching, and they wanted as full an agreement as possible, and they wanted it fast.
My advice to them, and of course we only facilitated, I want to get that absolutely clear, they discussed amongst themselves. I said that pace was important, but that it also, the more comprehensive the agreement, the better.
In other words, a coalition was preferable to a minority government whose day-to-day survival could depend on Lib Dem votes. The Conservatives seemed to agree.
And it became fairly clear fairly rapidly that there were not only areas of policy agreement, but that the Conservative team were willing to make quite real concessions.
That suddenly, actually, we could form a coalition with these people, and they are acting rationally, and they too want to put the national interest first. So pretty soon it became clear that this wasn't just one of 2 options, it was actually the leading option.
I could see, actually, from quite early on, when they came together, the Conservatives and the Lib Dems, and they seemed to have a very high degree of trust with each other, that it was quite possible that it would evolve the way it did.
You could observe the rapport.
You could observe the body language, exactly.
The room they negotiated in looked out on the back of number 10.
If we had a break in the negotiations, George would say, look, we're only yards there from the windows of Downing Street. This is how close we are to being able to form the government. Gordon Brown is in there wondering what we're doing. And we have to make sure we are getting him out and providing a new government.
Hello, William, can you